We believe we need the news to stay informed, but it mostly fills our minds with useless, misleading, or damaging information. For generations, it was considered that being someone who keeps up with the news is somehow an intellectual, a very serious person, because they are up to date on the world events and what the media and government tells them is true. When in reality, the news is no different to the salacious weekly gossip magazines that cost less than a shop-owned brand bottle of water. The news, whether left-wing, right-wing, alternative or mainstream, is for the most part a spectacle of propaganda and mindless entertainment that serves two purposes: to extract your money and time, and to distract you from the realities of the world. During this series, I will demonstrate with hard facts and logic why the news is in fact just mindless entertainment that is no different to Wheel of Fortune or NPC meme TikTok streams. It soaps up your brain to make it incredibly smooth. I will show that journalism does not uncover the truth and hold the powerful accountable, but actually, quite often, acts as an arm of government. The news media possesses too much power that not only is used by the government to get what they want, but also influences government by shaping the opinions of the general public. When I say news, what am I actually talking about? For those of you who believe you are clever, you already know what the word news means. But for those of you who have better things to remember, I will tell you, news literally means new information. But we're talking about the news media, newspapers like The Guardian, The Daily Mail, Washington Post, The New Zealand Herald, China Daily, TV news like the BBC, CNN, Fox, and the online versions of those, and news outlets who have an exclusively online presence like Huffington Post, The Tiger, Vice, and BuzzFeed, RIP. There is also, of course, radio news, which in the UK is dominated by the BBC. When we refer to the news, we are talking about journalism-based news media, and not a bulletin board at work or family announcements. News tells you what's going on. People who consume it believe it keeps them informed. However, the news is carefully selected chunks of information to feed to the public about carefully selected new and current events. If the news was a dietitian, they would be telling you to eat whatever food was either popular, they had invested interest in, or that they knew would get you addicted to. Coca-Cola, Pfizer cookies, and fentanyl-infused hot dogs. It would not be anything that offers nutritional value. Some would argue that news wasn't always bad, and that there was some kind of golden age of news and journalism. However, I am not entirely convinced. News is purely entertainment that makes us unhappy because it stirs up some of the worst aspects of the human condition: fear and hate. In the German city of Strasbourg in 1605, a spark of ingenuity would change the world forever by one man with a vision, Johann Carolus. Carolus worked as a news scribe in Strasbourg. The job of a scribe was to write the news by hand and turn it into the printing press before being distributed to subscribers. This kind of distributed news had been around since the early days of the Roman Empire, but had become more prolific after the invention of the printing press in 1436. However, this news was still the reserve of the wealthy elite, as the process was expensive, and most regular people couldn't read anyway. The rest of the population, who could either read and couldn't afford newsletters or were poor and illiterate, got their news the old-fashioned way, through word of mouth. Before the invention of the printing press and newspapers, the majority of the news was local. You just knew about what was happening in your little corner of the world, and aside from idle gossip, it was mostly beneficial. If there was a flood, locals would want and need to know about it. If there was a shortage of something, locals would want and need to know about it. If an invading army was on its way, locals would want and need to know. Newsletters, on the other hand, provided much more news from across the country and the world. And Carolus wanted more people to be able to have access to this news, and to no longer be just a reserve of the wealthy elite. The technological advancements in printing made this possible, and in 1605 he printed the first issue of the Relation aller Phänomen und what it says on the screen, or The Relation of Strasbourg. This was a weekly newspaper that served the free imperial city of the Holy Roman Empire of the German nation. Quite the title. Though there isn't too much known about the Relation of Strasbourg, up until recently it was thought that the first issue was published in 1609 and not 1605. It is understood that it covered a wide range of topics, such as politics, economics, and social issues. Its circulation and readership numbers are unknown, but what is known is its influence and legacy. It pioneered the newspaper format, increased accessibility to news, expanded what was covered by the news, advanced the principles of journalism, and influenced the foundation of subsequent newspapers across the world. And this influence soon spread to the English-speaking world in the United Kingdom. In 1622, the Weekly News was founded. Nathaniel Butter was a printer who decided to translate the Dutch weekly newspaper Courante, or News from Italy, Germany, Hungary, Spain, and France, into English with the assistance of two stationers, Thomas Archer and Nicholas Bourne. Like the paper that it copied, it was focused on foreign affairs, but wanted to spread this news to more and more people. This was all well and good, but most people didn't really benefit from foreign affairs, and nor did they have much interest in it. Foreign affairs were important to the elite because they had financially invested interest abroad, such as shares, trading, and the trade of goods. Not to mention the fact that a lot of elites were noblemen and royalty, who were related to other noblemen and royalty across Europe. Foreign news had a direct effect on their lives, and it was important to know about it. For the vast majority of the great unwashed, it was pretty irrelevant. But then in 1642, the English Civil War came. The war gave way to a 20-year period where more than 300 new news publications were founded. The Civil War was national news that affected every single citizen of the United Kingdom. Though most people could not read still, the news of daily events during the war was spread faster than any previous event. In 1665, the first real newspaper was published, and by 1702, Britain saw its first successful daily newspaper. By 1860, the so-called Golden Age of newspaper publication came, and by 1901, the Daily Mail was founded and gave birth to a completely new style of journalism. The progress of news circulation was fueled by three factors: literacy, technology, and freedom of expression. Literacy rates in England during the mid-17th century was thought to be around 30% for males. However, the definition of literacy during the 17th and 18th century was judged on whether a person could sign their name and not necessarily their ability to read. Big cities such as London had higher literacy rates of up to 90% by the mid-18th century, and news there was rapidly becoming the choice form of recreational reading. By the end of the 18th century, the Industrial Revolution was in full swing, and this technological advancement of humanity changed everything. By the end of the 19th century, literary rates had risen to 97.2% for both men and women, and printing press technology had become faster and cheaper, and so had national distribution. For the longest time, reading had been the reserve of the elites. Most average Joes and Janes forms of entertainment and information distribution was limited. It was all word of mouth, telling stories, spreading gossip, and relaying what someone could read occasionally told them. When more people could read, and more newspapers were available, the newspaper became the most popular form of recreational escapism and entertainment. And like most average people, the interest in foreign affairs and economics was minimal, because most people enjoy good stories, and good stories are based on the principles of drama. Being informed wasn't the prime objective of the news, because most people didn't benefit so much. It was all very well for the elites to be alerted to the social issues of the working classes, but the working classes already knew how tough life was. They wanted to know what Mrs. Smith from number 32 was up to late at night, and Mrs. Smith could easily be Mrs. von Blomkamp from Rotterdam. The end of the 19th century and the dawn of the 20th century brought in the new era of news, yellow and tabloid journalism. The term yellow journalism was coined in America in the mid-1890s to describe the type of sensationalist news journalism during the circulation war between two of the USA's biggest newspaper moguls, William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer. Yellow journalism was powered by lust for war. By the 19th century, the rivalry between William Randolph Hearst's New York Journal and Joseph Pulitzer's New York World had reached peak intensity. Sensationalist tactics were used to attract readers, so the loudest and most outrageous headlines and stories won the daily battle for readership. In 1898, the USS Maine was sunk in Havana Harbor. This was a perfect tragedy to be exploited by both Hearst and Pulitzer. Though the exact cause of the explosion was, and still is, unclear, both Hearst and Pulitzer's newspapers ran with sensational headlines pointing fingers at Spain, saying that this was an act of sabotage and stoking anti-Spanish sentiment throughout the nation. The New York Journal and the New York World used big, bold, dramatic language to stir up conspiracy and drive the anti-Spanish narrative. This had a profound influence on public opinion. Hyperbolic and emotional language worked a spell on the everyday Joes and Janes of America. This incident was an international act of aggression by the Spanish that demanded a very stern response. The public became more and more riled up, and the pressure reached the doors of the White House and President William McKinley. The sensationalist narrative helped create a climate that rejected the concepts of peaceful resolution and diplomacy, and the US was to act with a show of strength and conduct military intervention in Cuba, where tensions between the Spanish colonial government and the Cuban rebels had been escalating. Eventually, the US was pressured closer and closer to declaring war with Spain on April 25, 1898. Hearst and Pulitzer got what it appeared they wanted. The American-Spanish War would last until August the 13th, and the newspapers of Hearst and Pulitzer milked it for every last conceivable drop. The consequences of this short and somewhat forgotten war were far-reaching. It led to the liberation of Cuba and the American acquisition of territories like Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. News media had reached a new peak in sustainable business growth. It could actually create and perpetuate its own news cycles. It had also discovered how very powerful it could be. No longer was it just telling people what the government was up to, it was actively telling the government what to do, because of its influence on the public was far greater than even the most charismatic politicians could ever be. A few years before the Hearst, Pulitzer and American-Spanish Wars, the news industry in the UK experienced a very similar new revolution with the founding of the Daily Mail in 1896. But it did significantly help popularise the new style of journalism that had parallels with American yellow journalism. The Mail, like the papers of Hearst and Pulitzer, focused on sensationalism and human interest stories. It tapped into the public's emotions and personal experiences, and with shocking and scandalous content that they couldn't get enough of. Articles were shorter, punchier, with attention-grabbing headlines. This all catered to every level of literacy and attention. It used more illustrations and photographs that had ever been used before, which captured even more reader attention. All of these elements, along with its mix of entertainment, news and lifestyle content, led to a much broader public appeal. It wanted both the educated and the working classes to be its core readership, and it succeeded. One thing that the Mail did was engage with public affairs. It advocated for causes like the suffrage movement and social reform. Its wide influence is utilised to actually shape public opinion and drive change, and the Daily Mail has continued to do so ever since. During the last 20 years alone, the Mail has successfully interfered with the Stephen Lawrence murder investigation and convinced every supermarket in Britain to charge for plastic bags. The Mail was, and still is, an unstoppable force for public change, perhaps more so than any activist, politician, or dare I say it, celebrity. Just like the New York Journal and the New York World, the Daily Mail wasn't just reporting news, it was creating it and gaining huge influence. The Daily Mail's huge successful business model, which also incorporated advertising, spurred other newspapers to adopt similar strategies to remain competitive. The newspaper industry was forever transformed, with many competitors turning to this lucrative tabloid style. Though yellow journalism died in the early 20th century, its legacy and influence, much like the Daily Mail's, lived on forever. Technology brought new kinds of news media, such as radio, TV and the internet. The core of its business model and style remained pretty much the same. The news carefully crafts what we should care about, and what we should know, and what we should do. One of the biggest news cycles of the 2000s was the disappearance of Madeleine McCann. Madeleine disappeared after being left to sleep in her ground floor holiday apartment in Praia da Luz in Portugal, whilst her parents dined with friends at a nearby restaurant. 10 p.m. that evening, Madeleine was discovered to be missing. The case of Madeleine's disappearance became one of the most heavily reported missing person cases in history, and despite the abundance of coverage, talk show appearances, and public thirst to remain informed, she was never found. Out of all the thousands of missing children cases that happen each year, why was Madeleine so important? Because it was a great story. A simple family holiday at a popular resort gone wrong. This tapped into the fears of every parent. This event had everything: outrage, fear, intrigue, an intoxicating emotional cocktail for the perfect story. The public, not just in the UK, couldn't get enough of it, and the news outlets on TV, in print, and on radio kept feeding the addiction. The McCann case kept the lights on in the office, put food on the table, and paid for holidays in the sun. The news media needed it, and solving the case and finding her would have been the worst thing that could have happened. Stories like Madeline's are cash cows and direct the point of public focus and emotion. The interest in her news cycle heavily influenced the overall investigation. Estimations on the cost of the average missing person case in the UK is around £2,415. Bear in mind that this can fluctuate based on an abundance of different factors. However, the search for Madeleine McCann is estimated to have cost £13.1 million. This sum does not include any donations or fundraising done by or for the McCann family. This is the total amount given to the Operation Grange task force that managed the search for Madeleine from the British government. Madeleine's disappearance wasn't the first of its kind. There was a similar disappearance in 1991, that of 21-month-old Ben Needham on the Greek island of Kos. Like Madeleine, Ben's case was a curious mystery filled with theories and supposed sightings, and like Madeleine, he was never found. Ben's disappearance did make headlines, and there was some appearances by the family and investigators on TV news and daytime shows, but it wasn't anywhere near the extent of Madeleine McCann's. As of 2016, the search for Ben cost around £1 million. Madeleine's disappearance showed how influential news media was, and that when the public were attracted to a news story, the news media would run with it for as long as it generated interest and healthy revenue. In tune, the news media creates a feedback loop where the public's interest causes newspapers to keep on creating content for them to consume. And this public interest influences the authorities to step up the investment of time and resources that go into the investigation, which provides even more news coverage to feed and stir up public interest. The news media has almost unlimited power and influence. The news media's coverage of Madeleine's case didn't lead to her being found, nor finding out whatever happened to her. It was an example of the news media feeding the public's morbid curiosity that pressured the investigators. The biggest winners were the news media. Everyone else didn't gain much in the end, and some of them, such as the McGanns, ended up losing even more. To say that the news media's lust for juicy news cycles is always negative would be dishonest, because sometimes they, and the public addiction to gossip and sensationalism, can inadvertently lead to positive change. It's not just the banning of plastic bags and the convictions of killers that they can influence. They can influence the public enough to save thousands of lives. In contrast, there was another, older young lady that dominated the news headlines in the UK during the 2000s. Her name was Jade Goody. Jade rose to fame on Big Brother before becoming a rich celebrity and rising to infamy after appearing on Celebrity Big Brother. Jade's whole life was on show, and that was her brand. People couldn't get enough of hearing about Jade, whether they loved her or hated her. You would think that the disappearance of Madeleine McCann would be a far more important story than any story relating to some vacuous D-list celebrity who was famous for being bad at geography. But you'd be wrong. The final Jade Goody news cycle had a far more positive impact on society than Madeleine's ever did. In August of 2008, Jade confirmed she had cervical cancer, and by September, confirmed it was advanced and life-threatening. Her cancer was announced as terminal in February 2009, and shortly after that, in March 2009, Jade passed away and left behind a unique legacy. The news of Jade's cancer was reported widely and frequently, and this desire to know the lurid ins and outs of someone we don't know's business actually produced some world-changing benefits. In the months after announcing her cancer as terminal, the UK medical authorities reported an extra 400,000, mostly young, women had gone for tests. This unexpected surge in testing had reversed a concerning downtrend in cervical cancer screening seen during the previous decade. Jade's final news cycle ended with a positive bang and should be celebrated, but one lesson remains the same. The news media had unlimited power and influence. No politician or public health campaign or multi-million-pound propaganda drive could have led to such an increase in smear testing. The cases of Madeleine McCann and Jade Goody demonstrate how the news media milks stories and creates ongoing news cycles. They see what news stories gain public interest and keep on feeding their hunger until interest dwindles and disappears. The news media do have huge influence, but don't exactly manufacture the event itself. No one is accusing them of being behind the disappearance of Madeleine McCann. But this is not always the case, as they have, and still do, actually manufacture news cycles. The greatest news cycles should have two key elements: longevity and potential for lots of different content. And nothing supplies this quite as well as war. War is the news media's #1 friend.
Well, gentlemen, it seems you have little option now but to declare war immediately.
Well, this is quite impossible. I couldn't take such a decision without referring to my superior, Chris Patton. He's in Hong Kong.
Good, because he's on the line now via satellite. Mr. Patton, what do you think of the idea of a war now? I'll take that as a yes.
Very well, it's war.
War it is.
That's it, Chris. It's war. War has broken out. This is a war.
That's it. Yes, it's war. From now on, the Day-to-Day will be providing the most immediate coverage of any war ever fought. On the front line and in your face, Donald Bethlehem.
Standing by, Douglas Hurd.
The Day-to-Day smart bombs have nose-mounted cameras. This is Smart Bomb Stephen, and that is Susanna Gekkelois.
I'll be reporting from inside the fight.
Like some crazy Trojan. And keeping an eye on everything that's going on out there at the Day-to-Day news pipe, Douglas Trox. Chris. But first, the weather from Sylvester Stewart.
America's role in the First World War was a neutral one. When war broke out in Europe in 1914, American news media was firm with its stance on isolationism. When Woodrow Wilson was re-elected in 1916, he won with a campaign that said he kept us out of the war. However, though the people of America were neutral to a degree, individuals did have sympathy for one side or the other, and this was reflected by news media publications. On the 11th of July 1916, the New York Times dedicated its first 2 pages to cover the visit of a German submarine loaded with dyestuffs to Baltimore. The coverage included photographs and narratives about the submarine's crew, even featuring an upbeat interview with Captain Paul Koenig, who shared details about his U-boat's onboard library and their interest in Shakespeare. Woodrow Wilson's wartime policy began to shift, and in 1917, America declared war on Germany, and this was reflected by the news media. By this time, the news media had radically shifted from neutrality or supporting Germany, full-on war-loving propagandists. The New York Times daily graphics showing which American states had provided the most recruits and purchased the most war bonds. Before the official declaration of war, newspapers shifted from showing harrowing images of the front line in Europe to showing patriotic images of American training camps and military parades. What had happened was the newspapers were mirroring the sentiment of the government and the people, and in turn influencing more of the people to choose sides. And when war was declared, the relationship between the government and the newspapers had shifted. Newspapers still had heavy influence over public opinion, but now it was being utilized by the government. In its pursuit of making the world safe for democracy, the Wilson administration initiated actions within the United States to restrict a fundamental democratic principle, freedom of the press. This strategy was to oversee, influence, and suppress all news reporting. Within a mere week of Congress declaring war on the 13th of April 1917, President Wilson issued an executive order that birthed a new federal entity. This new agency, the Committee on Public Information, aka the CPI, was given the responsibility of actively influencing and molding news media narratives. Its primary mission was to convey to numerous young men facing military conscription, as well as the many Americans who had previously advocated for neutrality, the rationale for now endorsing the war effort. The newly established agency gained its more common name as the Creel Committee, derived from its chairman, George Creel, a former journalist with pre-war experience. From its inception, the CPI acted as a compelling draw for political progressives spanning various backgrounds, including intellectuals, investigative journalists, and socialists. These individuals collectively held a deep concern about the perceived threat to democracy posed by German militarism. By this time, newspapers were big business, and the most popular form of digesting information and entertainment. In places like New York, there were dozens of daily newspapers in circulation, and newspapers like these were the most effective way of spreading the message. For the majority of journalists, their primary interaction with the CPI centered on its news division. During its brief existence of just a year and a half, the CPI's news division embarked on a mission to shape the coverage of the war in American news media. One tactic involved overwhelming journalists with an avalanche of paperwork, producing approximately 6,000 press releases, equating to an average of more than 10 releases per day. This approach exploited a common aspect of wartime journalism. Readers had a huge appetite for war-based news, and newspapers itched to deliver it. Whilst the government implemented measures to restrict reporters' access to soldiers, generals, munitions manufacturers, and other participants in the war effort, they simultaneously stoked the demand for news while artificially constraining its supply. The government effectively filled the resulting information void by providing a substantial number of official narratives designed to resemble news. Newspaper editors couldn't get enough of this government-created content. In addition to bombarding the news media with constructive narratives, they also issued a set of supposed voluntary guidelines. The guidelines were aimed to assist patriotic editors who wanted to support the war effort. The implication was that those editors who didn't follow these suggested guidelines would be less patriotic, and nobody was wanting that kind of label. While George Creel rejected the characterization of his committee's efforts as propaganda, he acknowledged that the core of their work revolved around managing public perceptions. In a reflective note written in 1920, he described the CPI as not merely a war fought in France alone, rather a straightforward public relations endeavor, an expansive venture in persuasive communication, the most extensive advertising campaign the world had ever seen. The CPI represented an extensive endeavor in propaganda. Not only did the CPI wield a heavy hand that influenced the newspaper reporting of the First World War, so did newly created censorship laws that were specifically made to craft media narratives. One significant law was the Espionage Act, which was passed by US Congress on the 15th of June 1917. This act built upon the Defense Secrets Act of 1911, which criminalized the collection and sharing of information on military installations and facilities with anyone who didn't hold appropriate clearances. The Espionage Act would go further by targeting any activities that were considered dangerous or disloyal. The government wanted to make sure that no information on defense, including any types of documents from photographs to signal books, were passed on to America's enemies. It outlawed statements that would interfere with operations, any attempts at insubordination, and any statements considered to falsely promote Americans' enemies. Anyone found guilty of such charges could face 20 to 30 years in prison, and even death, plus a $10,000 fine. Postal officials were given authority to ban any newspaper or magazine from distribution should they appear to be defying the Espionage Act. During a message to Congress, President Wilson said that there were millions of men and women of German birth and native sympathy who live amongst us, and if there should be disloyalty, it will be dealt with a firm hand of repression. This was a sharp U-turn in attitude by the United States, and now any newspaper who'd previously shown sympathy for the German cause in Europe would be under heavy scrutiny. Things went even further in May 1918 when the Sedition Act was passed. The Sedition Act made any disloyal, profane, scurrilous, or abusive language about the Constitution, the government, the American uniform, or the American flag a criminal act. Following the passing of both acts, over 2,100 people were prosecuted by the government. Through the passing of the Sedition and Espionage Acts, the creation of the CPI, newspapers had found that their vast influence was not one built upon the notion of the free press. The free press were only free to say what they liked if the government liked it. So it was their duty to promote and report on what the government was doing, but in a flattering light. The Supreme Court upheld convictions under the Acts, but would later reverse its stance to protect free speech. However, the precedent was set and nothing was really the same again. During World War II, the Office of War Information, or the OWI, was responsible for controlling news, and all news material about the war had to pass through it. The Office of War Information also created a Code of Wartime Practices, which was a set of guidelines for the press to follow. It was just a repeat of World War I. In the UK, it was the same story. Instead of the OWI, it had the totally non-Orwellian sounding Ministry of Information, which established its own code of wartime practices for the British press. The news media had clear objectives that they had to follow during and pre-wartime. Promote the war effort, whether it started or not. Censorship, guidelines and regulations have always been used by governments to guide the narrative of the news media, and thus control the public perception and sentiment. This doesn't happen for everything. You will still get presidents getting pleasured in the Oval Office and politicians having so-called illegal tea parties being front page news. But when it comes down to war and similar acts of that nature, the news media is instantly turned from a voice that speaks truth to power to one that helps wield power on behalf of the powerful. We have seen this happen in the build-up to the invasion of Iraq in 2004. And the news media love a healthy news cycle, so it's a win-win. But opposing war and reporting on atrocities that outrage and scare the public can be as equally profitable as promoting war with a thumping drum. But during that time, there was a serious lack of skepticism towards the claims that Saddam Hussein's regime possessed weapons of mass destruction. The very thought of those weapons, especially in the new post-9/11 world, was juicy enough news to scare the public into demanding intervention. The protest in London against the proposed war in Iraq was one of the largest ever held, and yet the coverage was minimal and objective. War was what the powers wanted, and war was what they were going to get. Every time there was even a sniff of war, the news media plays its key role in stirring the public up with fear. Just before the COVID-19 pandemic, the news media was sure war would pop off after the assassination of Iranian General Qasem Soleimani. But sadly for the American war machine and the news media, it never happened. Quite often, there will be incidents where a war is possible because of some act of aggression from a country who aren't so friendly with the West, and the news media will be proposing war. This is a regular occurrence with countries like Iran, North Korea, and Russia. More recently, it is the war in Ukraine that has dominated the news media and almost all media coverage. Ukrainian conflict is, by definition, a proxy war, similar to the Russian-Afghanistan war of the 1980s. There has been a serious lack of objectivity towards the war in Ukraine because there are two sides and the news media is on one of them, Ukraine's. The rhetoric around the war has been clearly steered towards as much intervention as is legally possible in this situation. But the news media want more. They have consistently spoken of scenarios where Russia crosses the line and either enters or attacks NATO territory, thus allowing the Allied forces of the US and the UK and the rest to enter into a full-scale world war. Like Adolf Hitler and Saddam Hussein, Putin is painted as a confusing pantomime villain, one who must be stopped. He's calculated and clever, but also suffering from mental health problems and therefore unstable. He's winning and a danger to the stability of Europe, but he's also losing. This flip-flopping of subplot narrative doesn't make sense, and it doesn't need to. All that is needed is the public support for aggression against Russia. Not too long ago, Ukraine was painted as a corrupt and backward nation that had a huge problem with neo-Nazi militias, ungoverned by the kind of tin pot dictatorship more commonly seen in the Third World. Now, any mention of this corruption or the countless neo-Nazis is dismissed, and those who point out these facts are labelled as pro-Russian traitors and Putin sympathizers, much like the press who dared to speak out against the government during the 2 world wars. You can call out atrocities of war, such as the infamous Abu Ghraib incident during the Iraq War, but you would never plead Saddam Hussein's case. That would be madness. The news media has great influence over our lives. It is able to craft and control public opinion. It can change our minds about war and make social change. The news media is more powerful than the voice of the government. Yet when it comes to certain news cycles, it bows down to the government and becomes their tool. But to put all the blame on the news media and or the government would be wrong. We all have to take some accountability. This is a phenomenon that moves in circular waves. The news media influences the people. People influence the government, and the government then influence the media to influence the people. This cycle doesn't always go round like that every time. There are some variations, but the principle of it is clear enough. Our desire for gossip and news is insatiable, and we give the news media too much power and influence because of it. For the most part, the news media mostly serve us news stories and information that is completely useless,